to the Make a Mental Note podcast, where mental health professionals share information and perspectives that illuminate, educate, and is worthy of a mental note. And now your host, Chris Quarto.
Hey everyone, this is Chris Quarto. Welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. I hope you're having a great week. Today's podcast episode has to do with the child welfare system, and I thought that it would be good to give you this excerpt from an interview that was done with an 18-year-old girl who had been in different foster care placements throughout the course of her childhood and adolescence. And here's what she said. The placements didn't work because in my heart I felt alone, but in my mind I felt grown. The only problem in the home was me. There I was, almost 13, and hated the world. I couldn't trust anyone. I didn't want to trust anyone. How could I trust someone? I had to protect myself from hurt. And the only way I could do that was to guard my heart. I messed up 4 homes because of this. You know, I think this excerpt really captures the experiences of many foster kids. You know, many of these kids are just looking for something very basic. What Abraham Maslow talked about with his hierarchy of needs model, essentially the need to feel safe and secure. Well, that's what today's podcast episode is all about. Sheri Pickover is here to share her experiences working in the child welfare system, and I think you'll really enjoy what she has to say. So here's Sheri. Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. Thanks for joining me today. Our guest today is Sheri Pickover, who is a professor in the counseling program at the University of Detroit Mercy. And Sheri, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit more about who you are and what type of work that you do?
Well, I'm an associate professor at the University of Detroit Mercy. I'm a counselor educator.
All right.
And also a clinical mental health counselor, which I've been doing for about 30 years.
Wow.
I work in the counseling program, teaching courses in human development and trauma and crisis skills. And I also am the clinic director of our practicum clinic, where students come and they practice before they go to their internship.
Oh.
The UDM Counseling Clinic I founded in 2004, and we primarily work with clients who are court mandated for services but can't afford to pay them. So our goal is to really both train our students in the concept of social justice, understanding what you need to do to give back, and at the same time they get training in how to be effective before they leave and go out into the community.
Well, that's great. Well, you and I share something in common, Sheri, because back in, I guess it was 2005, I established our clinic, which is our practicum students provide services as well to the community at a low cost. And it's really nice because I think when you look at the training that they get with the technology and everything that we have in our particular clinic, it really sets them up well for internship experiences. And I think they feel a lot more confident going out in their internships.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, they're terrified when they come in. Like, and it's so funny because, we use the term real clients, like any human being isn't real.
Yes.
But they're all real.
That's right.
But the fact that these, I kind of set it up to, I'm like, these people don't care that you're students.
Yeah.
They're coming because they need to have their needs met.
That's exactly right.
And it kind of really helps shift their focus away from themselves to really understanding what the profession's about.
Exactly. Well, you've got a lot of experience. I mean, 30 years in the field, so I imagine that really helps you in your teaching as well.
Yes. It's really helpful to run a clinic when you teach clinical mental health and have a lot of clinical background, because then your stories don't get stale.
Yeah. Well, talking about stories, why don't you tell us your story about how you got involved in the mental health field? I mean, why did you want to go into this field, Sheri?
That is such a good question because it is a really interesting story.
Mm-hmm.
I have a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan
Mm-hmm.
in psychology and creative writing and literature.
Wow.
My plan was to be a writer.
Uh-huh.
That's what I wanted to do. So the psychology degree was actually the second major I did, not
Mm-hmm.
the first one.
All right.
And I worked on the yearbook, and I was working in newspapers, and that was my goal. I was going to go into journalism and write the great American novel. And I graduated at a time, when we were in a recession and couldn't get a job.
Yes, uh-huh.
And I got offered a position at a publishing company in New York for $13,500 a year.
Okay.
And yeah, my parents wouldn't let me go because my father said my family's originally from New York, and he goes, "You would be living in a box." So I was doing temp work and looking at positions. And literally, this is what happened. There was an ad for a counselor, a bachelor-level counselor, at a runaway shelter just outside of Detroit. And I remember looking at the ad and going, I have one of those.
Yeah.
I have a bachelor's degree.
Sure, why not?
And exactly. So I applied, and for some strange reason, they ended up hiring me. Mm-hmm. It was a crisis shelter. I worked the afternoon shift. 3 to 11, children 10 to 17. We would do daily crisis counseling and family sessions. I had no idea what I was doing with a bachelor's degree, and after about a year and a half, I realized that, in fact, I was pretty good at it. And again, I mentioned the creative writing and literature because I like to tell stories.
Uh-huh.
So the story of what led me to get my master's degree was we had a horrible, horrible crisis. A child basically tried to kill himself and other people by slamming a van into the building.
Oh, boy.
And the mental health professionals who were in the building working with those children, they weren't our kids. They were group home children who'd been in the foster care system. The therapists were so upset they left and went home. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting there dealing with those kids, and I thought, if I'm going to have these skills, I really need the master's degree.
Yeah.
So I made the decision to go get my master's degree, which I did from the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And then I returned to Michigan, and from that point on, I worked in a series of child welfare positions. I would started doing outreach. Most of my career was primarily outreach work.
All right.
Where I would go to the homes of the families, work to reunify them with their children, family work, structural family therapy, strategic family therapy, and then foster care, where I would see the children in their foster homes for therapy, do all their case management, pick them up, take them to their family home, do the family therapy session.
Wow.
Leave them there, maybe drive them back. And then I actually did foster home licensing, residential work with severely emotionally impaired children, kind of ended up back at outreach, made the decision to go get my doctorate, and was working full-time during that. And then graduated and was really quite lucky to end up being able to stay in the area that I knew so well in Detroit.
Yeah, what a story. So you've got a lot of experience working with clients in the child welfare system, and I wonder, looking back at those experiences, Sheri, do you find that these kids and families that you worked with, were there common themes or stories that seemed to underlie their problems? What did you find in your experiences?
That's such a great question, because I think what happened is, I have the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah.
So, that themes I can look at from their themes and my themes, which is I started the way most people start, which is thinking that there's a straight line between whatever concerns they have and the solution.
Okay.
And of course that isn't the case. It's so complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And So, I mean, looking back, what I would say is the themes are, this isn't my quote, this is actually a quote from Harry Aponte.
Okay.
People do the best they can with what they have.
Ah, so true.
And, you know, what I came to realize is everybody's human development is different.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's access to resources is different. We cannot assume that cognitive development is the same just because you get to a certain age.
Right.
That you automatically know things.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, the themes for me that came up were kind of that idea of people not being viewed through the lens of really good clinical assessment, but rather really through this moral kind of lens.
Mm-hmm.
You just did a bad thing and you kind of have to fix it. And
right.
The children are viewed that way, the parents are viewed that way, in many ways the foster parents are viewed that way. And what I found...
I was just kind of curious, who views them that way, Sheri? Is it people in general or people within the welfare system, child welfare system that kind of view them that way? I mean, who views them that way?
Well, I think the child welfare system unto itself has a culture.
Yeah.
You know, and that culture... you know, which can very easily kind of take over everything. People, for lack of a better term, get sucked into it.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, they get sucked into that culture, and so that view becomes really pervasive, that, you know, everything is about behavior. You know, the foster parents, you know, this child's, you know, wetting the bed, make them stop. And instead of taking a step back and going, okay, they have grief, they have loss, they have trauma, they have neglect. You know, what are all the reasons behind this before we intervene? You know, the rush is to, well, make it stop before they, you know, we lose this placement. And so things become, so those are the themes that I saw, was kind of this idea of people kind of being caught in this tornado, and everybody being very well-meaning and very caring and wanting to help, but maybe not pulling themselves back enough.
I think that because you were saying before that in your work when you did the, I think you were saying you were doing in-home services, the outreach, that you had mentioned doing strategic therapy, structural therapy. So you were using a lot of those family therapy approaches, and I guess that when you operate from that perspective, you're more likely to look at a broader context to help you understand what's going on, as opposed to just looking at an individual child who might be bedwetting or acting out issues, and simply looking at behaviors. That you tried to look at context and understand it that way.
Yeah, that's an excellent way to put it, because I mean, ultimately, you know, when I said if I were to break it all down, you know, people do the best they can with what they have, and that's really what I saw. Was, you know, people living in situations where they really were trying to do the best they could with what they knew.
Yeah.
And you know, it was very rare in my career that I ever ran up against people who didn't really love their children, or didn't really want things, you know, to be better, or children who don't love their parents. I remember I would often say to parents, you know, when we would have good rapport and we would eventually get to the point where we could do this. I never did it in the first or second session. But you know, I could sometimes say, like, I never met a foster kid who wouldn't forgive their parent anything, as long as they were fighting for them.
Right.
And so that, I guess, you know, the themes I saw is that, you know, humanity does have a universality to it. And that, you know, people really are just trying and struggling with what they have, and sometimes it's assumed that they have access to things they don't.
Yeah, and I think that that assumption probably comes from not really educating yourself about what other people go through, and poverty or whatever the case may be, to truly understand what other people are struggling with. And you really can't know that unless you do your job, and I guess I'm talking as a graduate student or even as a professor, to really understand and to educate yourself about those types of issues.
Yeah, because I mean, we're human, and we get triggered by stuff. We all have our values, and I always tell my students, because they come in going, "Oh, I don't judge everybody," and I always say everybody's Judgy McJudge. We all are. Of course, right. We judge. The issue isn't to say that you don't do it. The issue is to recognize when you do.
That's a good point.
So that you can step it aside, and that's a lot of the reason in the book that my colleague and I just published on therapeutic interventions for families and children in the child welfare system. We have basically 2 of the initial chapters are just about the way the child sees the world and the way the adults see the world.
Oh, that's interesting. That's great. And I'm gonna make sure and put that in the show notes, so if people want to get that book, they can get that. And in your work, Sheri, with clients, I assume that there can be a variety of feelings that these clients, the parents and the kids, can have. What types of feelings did you see coming out in your work with them, and where do you think those feelings were coming from?
That's such a great question, too, because, feelings are about empathy. Mm-hmm. And I always consider empathy to be foundational in any work you do with anybody.
Yes.
What feelings they have, let me start with the parents, the birth parents. Helplessness. Mm-hmm. There's nothing more expected of a human being than to be able to take care of your children. Mm-hmm. So when you can't, or someone comes in and says you can't, the shame and the guilt and the helplessness that overwhelms them and then, presents itself as anger and defensiveness. Mm-hmm. But that's really what I saw were people who were just really trying to make sure that they could wake up every morning with the weight of all this judgment on top of them, and, the courage that it took for them to just put one foot in front of the other to have to meet with me. I always tried to keep that in my forefront, because those were the feelings they were dealing with, this kind of overwhelming helplessness and hopelessness around this judgment, again, this kind of tornado. And for the foster care children, it's so much more complicated because it really depends on the age of the child. Mm-hmm. And so for the really young ones, they confusion. Mm-hmm. Really a lack of understanding of what on earth is happening. Yeah. Why people are asking them to do things when they're 5 years old. Uh-huh. To cope with things that, an adult couldn't cope with. But we expect that 5-year-old to be able, here, come stay with a stranger. Mm-hmm. Be okay. Yeah. So they struggle, they struggle with a lot of confusion, certainly a lot of anger, just over all of it, over, protesting the lack of their attachment figure being gone. So sadness, but, little children don't feel depression the way adults do. Mm-hmm. So that's why I use the word confusion more than I would say, depressed or sad, because really they're just bewildered in a lot of ways of trying to adapt, and, very young children really need stability. So I would say the older foster care children, and it really depends. Some of them feel a lot of guilt and shame as well. They think it's their fault that they destroyed their family by saying something. Or they're angry at a sibling because that sibling. And I would say the overall feeling I've seen in children, foster care children, is a lack of sense of safety. Mm. Their sense of knowing what's going to happen tomorrow, that stability is gone. And so they live in that constant threat over their heads.
It's and almost, so all the adults... No, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, I guess the thing that comes to mind for me when you say that is there's unpredictability. And it seems to me in situations where there's unpredictability, you become perhaps hypervigilant, wondering what's going to happen next, and the anxiety that comes along with that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I actually remember doing a family therapy session where two teenage girls, they were siblings, were living with a foster mom, and they'd lived with her whole life. But she wouldn't adopt them. She had other issues going on and didn't want to adopt, but she had committed to them. And there was, this kind of unspoken elephant in the room. And when I finally brought it up to say, I'm wondering if, you because it's not permanent, you don't feel safe. And, and the foster parent just kind of looked at me like, no, that's not it. And then one of the girls, she just goes, yes.
Wow.
I never know if you're going to throw us out, if I do something. And so, one of the two things happens. They either behave in a way to get them thrown out because, just make it happen already, or, they're walking on eggshells all the time trying to be perfect. And so, to me, my concern there as a counselor is to go, and really, just kind of as an adult who works with kids, is they're not developing, they're not growing, they're not getting what they need to grow. And so those feelings. And for the foster parent, there's also a lot of hopelessness and helplessness. Here, love somebody. Don't get too attached. Give them stability.
Yeah.
Be able to let them go. Don't get upset. And by the way, we're going to put another kid in your house. Have people come into your home that you've paid for and tell you how to run your life.
Yeah. I tell you, I really respect foster parents because I don't think I could ever do that for the reasons that you're saying right there. And I think it takes a real special person to be able to be a foster parent, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. And I have worked with some just really miraculously gifted parents in my career. And so, and again, it's kind of like their feelings because there's just pressure from every angle. I always say to my students, if you can do foster care, you can do anything because everyone hates you. The foster parents are mad at you, the kids are mad at you, the judge is mad at you, the lawyers are mad at you.
Yeah, I guess you develop some thick skin, don't you?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I thought was interesting, I think when you were talking about the feelings of the parents, that you used the phrase, the feelings that the parents present may be anger, but yet really underneath that might be some of the other things that you were talking about. Truly, it might be the shame and the guilt and some of those types of feelings that are really, and I think that's what's easy. I think that's easy to overlook with clients because the anger can be so intense. But if you don't look beyond that, then you're not really seeing the parent or the person for who they truly are and what they're really struggling with.
And you also can't build that engagement with them.
Right.
And that's one of the other things is it's kind of like, well, I'll work with the child and I'll work on building rapport with the child, but the parent should just work with me. And I'm so glad you brought that up because one of the quotes, and I have it in the book, but I've sort of quoted it endlessly in my career, is to say it's not their job to work with us. It's our job to work with them.
Yes. That's really good. Yeah. So true. And so you've worked with these kids, you've worked with these parents, the foster parents. So in terms of helping these families, what's the recipe for success? I mean, they've had some pretty significant problems. So what is it that you do to help them get from point A, where you're just starting to intervene with them in the beginning phases, to point B, where hopefully the kids are able to reunify with their families?
It's so complicated, and there isn't, I guess, a recipe for success.
Yeah.
I wish I could tell you there was. I don't know if there is one. I would say that the recipe for knowing that you've done what you can do to be effective is empathy, validation, dignity, promoting their welfare, not personalizing the situations. You know what? And I can give you two stories. I can give you a story of a success and a story where termination happened, but it was still in a way that respected people.
Okay.
And I think that that's maybe the best way to demonstrate it. I worked with a mom and her two sons And by the time that the case came to me, the case was already in termination because she had just refused to work with anybody for so long until they filed the petition to terminate her rights. And now, and of course, then she was, they've lit the fire. And I worked with her, and, to build rapport and to empathize and validate, and, really get her, as we worked to kind of get to this point. And I remember at one point, she just went, it's not fair. And I remember saying, how old are you again? And she told me, and I go, at what point did you not realize life wasn't fair? And she's just like, it's not. And because of the fact that I was able to get that defensiveness of hers down by validating and empathizing with her, she was able to, it went to termination, and then through best interests, she was able to get her kids back.
Wow.
And I mean, it went all the way to the end. And I don't, say, I take success for that. I think, that recipe of success was a culmination of someone lighting a fire underneath her. It's a great question, and I know you have all kinds of people listening to this podcast, but it's kind of like remembering the stages of change.
Yeah.
Just because you're ready for them to change doesn't mean they are.
Yeah.
And so, she got to the point where she was ready, and I hope that what I did was effective, and a lot of what I did really was just validated her worldview to the point where she knew that anything I then began challenging her on wasn't me judging her, but was in fact me saying, this is what the child welfare system needs from you in order to get your kids back.
Right.
Sort of allying with her in terms of advocating.
Well,
and then I had another...
Yeah, and I was just going to say, and you can go on in a sec, I was just going to say, really what you did to help this person, you were just using very good, solid counseling skills. I mean, you used those skills to set the stage for some of these other things to happen. And I think that oftentimes we overlook the importance of, or we don't even understand, I think, sometimes how powerful just these very basic elemental things are that we learn way back in graduate training, how powerful they really are. And so that's what I was kind of thinking about as you were talking about that story.
Yeah, to me I always use them as, they're foundational.
Yeah.
And yet, everybody wants to move to intervention. Here, let me give you homework. Yeah. Here, let me ask you a bunch of questions about why you made those decisions.
Yeah, exactly.
And look, I had to learn that the hard way too. And that's kind of the way I look at it. It's like, we all learned that the hard way, that it doesn't work and people just get mad at you.
Yep.
So you could learn it the hard way, or you could just listen to the old people and go, oh, maybe I should stop. That's kind of, the way I kind of talk to my students about it. It was like, look, you could make the same 100 mistakes I did. How long it took me to realize that working with kids that way or adults that way, that I wasn't getting anywhere.
Right.
And the other one was a case where we worked with a mom who was lower functioning, and she had 3 children, and only one of them was returned home to her.
Oh.
Because they realized that she could only really care for one child and not all 3. And yet what we were able to do was have a termination visit that was really therapeutic for everyone involved. And just being aware of, what saying goodbye meant. And it's interesting, this story isn't in the book. It's interesting how many stories ended up in my book. And now that you asked me that, I'm like, I didn't put that one in there. I guess, when I do the next edited version.
There you go.
But in this case, we were able to have a party. We had pictures. We made sure that everybody had pictures, that everybody had some kind of physical object of each other.
Oh, that's a great idea.
To remember each other by.
Yeah.
Kind of all those rituals that we go through when we, mourn or lose or say goodbye. And it was hard. It was lots of crying and sad. But I view that as a success.
Sure.
Because we gave somebody a good goodbye.
Right.
And that's often something that, people just don't get.
That's exactly right. Well, looking at this kind of work and the people that you've worked with, what have been some of the primary challenges in doing that kind of work, Sheri?
There's challenges. I would say the biggest challenge is, as a counselor, you're going to run into you're going to get in your own way.
What do you mean?
That's the countertransference is so severe.
Mm-hmm.
The desire to rescue the children from their parents.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that I could do this better. That, this is horrible and awful. The overwhelming sadness that is, it just drips into everything. And it, and you don't have a lot of successes. You talk about recipe for successes. I was amazed I could come up with 2. I've had really successful interventions, and then, I don't know what happens after that. There's a story at the beginning of my book, very true story about a little boy who I was working with, and he was traumatized and very angry, and I took him to see his father in prison. And I was talking about it the other night in class, and someone asked me, what happened to him? And I said, I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think the challenges are for the counselor to get really great supervision, to know that you're walking into a situation where it's sad. It really challenges you at an emotional level, your values. You're sitting across from people who, beat their children or neglect their children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or children who, do things that you're like, this is unusual.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And foster parents who do things, and you go, I worked with a foster parent, once who sent a note on the child to school that said, I wet the bed. And we were having a foster parent dinner, and I said, can we put a note on their table that says, I am mean to children? So, I would really say that those are the challenges. If you're a good counselor, all those challenges of counseling, of doing intervention,
mm-hmm.
I think those are kind of standard. It's the same for any client.
Yeah.
But for this field in particular in child welfare, it's knowing yourself. And if I could, I'll give you a story. These are 2 stories from the book, but one of them is very personal to me because it's kind of the reason that I teach the way I do.
Uh-huh.
I was working with a little girl, and I was getting supervision, and I was young, and she came in for physical abuse, and I worked at an agency that was very family-focused, which I agree with, but my supervisor didn't have experience with the population and was pushing me to reunify, and I know I probably shouldn't have.
Mm-hmm.
My assessment was going no, but, my supervisor was saying do it. I had a hard time advocating and standing up for myself, which happens to a lot of young people.
Right.
And again, like I said, you get in your own way. And I, again, we all come into the field. We all have our own stuff. That was my stuff, which was, not really being able to stand up for myself in a way that I worried about not being a good girl and not wanting to get in trouble. And so I did what my supervisor told me to do and recommended she go home, and she was back in a week for physical abuse.
Wow.
And, I tell that story to say that the one thing that taught me was, I didn't abuse her. Her father did. But it was still a really egregious ethical error on my part.
Yeah, and I think, and then you end up having to deal with your own feelings. We were talking about the feelings of parents and all that kind of stuff before, but when you do stuff like that and that happens, then you have to deal with your own feelings, and that's got to be tough.
Yeah, because what it did for me was say, I let my own issues get in the way of my client.
Yeah.
And that was unacceptable.
Uh-huh.
I didn't do my work that I needed to do to stand up, to advocate, to whatever. I let my own concerns about me get in the way of what was in the best interest of the person who was, in fact, more vulnerable. And so, I use it as an example because when you say, what are the challenges of working with these clients, that's the challenge. Mm-hmm. Because you are faced with unbelievably difficult cases, difficult decisions, kind of impossible. People always, well, what's the answer? And I'm like, sometimes there is just no good answer.
Uh-huh.
It is not even the lesser of five evils,
Oh, boy.
And those are the challenges, and those kind of things, and understanding, just the consequences. So, to answer your question, the challenge is more for the person who does it, mm-hmm. because the clients are clients. They're all going to come with stuff that, we got supervision for, and, working with substance abuse or working with somebody who has history of PTSD or trauma or attachment. And those are all challenging, absolutely. But really, it's our stuff.
Those are good points, Sheri. Well, we're at the point of the interview now, in our interview here on the podcast, that I refer to as Make a Mental Note. And I always like my guests to maybe share words of wisdom or tips that might help the listeners with their own mental health, with their own mental wellness. And is there anything that you might suggest to our audience members, to the mental note takers, things that they could do just to kind of help them with general everyday mental wellness or anything along those lines, Sheri?
There's so many kind of ideas like that out there, and I think what I would say is, as you do your research about being mentally well, it kind of goes back to the idea where, people always go, what's the best exercise? Mm-hmm. Right? And everybody has an opinion.
Right.
And I always answer with, the one you'll do.
That is so true.
Yeah. So that to me is, when you say, what's the best way for mental wellness? Uh-huh. The one you'll do. So, some people prefer meditation, some people prefer exercise, some people, prefer going to movies. I would say in general, just looking at your life and, kind of looking through it and going, where am I in my life? Mm-hmm. Where is what I need in my life? And whatever works has been effective in the past for you mm-hmm. to do. Yeah. Because, anybody else's suggestion at the end of the day is if you're like, oh, I don't like that.
That's right. You might not tell the other person that, but you're not going to do it.
Exactly. So that's why I said, rather than kind of going, well, try this or try that, I would just say, you know what? The one you'll do. Yeah. But, look at your life and go, where am I in it? And, what do I need for that? And then, there's hundreds of different, things to do. Yeah. I would say for people who are going to be entering the field, the new thing, get supervision. Mm-hmm. Whether you think you need it or not, it can be peer. It can be, someone who's been doing it a while. Everybody needs someone else to run something by.
Yeah.
It's really just the best way to know that you've sort of said something out loud and had someone else hear you.
Oh, exactly. And maybe even get their own counseling for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I heard you mention your book a couple of times, and I want to give you the opportunity to say a little bit more about it and how people can get that.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
It's called Therapeutic Interventions for Families and Children in the Child Welfare System. Mm-hmm. I'm an author along with my colleague Heather Brown, who is a art therapist and mental health counselor in private practice in Detroit. Okay. She worked with foster care children for about 10 years as we wrote it together. The book is available from Springer Publishing. It's also available on Amazon. It's not written as a textbook. It's really written, there's a lot of research in it, but it's primarily case studies with really specific hands-on interventions that I've used and Heather used, and that actually worked.
Wow, that's and that's what students are looking for, very practical types of things like that.
Yeah, and that's why we wrote it that way. Again, there's so many stuff out there that it's like, this is what trauma is, this is what attachment is. You should treat that. This is what behavior modification is. Yeah. You should do that. And I really wanted to write, for lack of a better term, a recipe book.
Yeah.
Where we have, in there, step 1.
Yeah, this is how you do it.
Yeah, and there's actually the chapter, and it's interesting, I didn't write it, Heather did, but I'm really proud of, she did this great chapter on beginning therapy. And she has this, wonderful where, she says, sit down, look the child in the eye, get to their level.
Yeah.
Say these things.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, wow, that would have been really helpful to know when you begin working with kids.
Oh, sure. Yeah, exactly. Because you don't know what you're doing, when you're first in the field.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's really, what we wrote it for. And then there's a section on countertransference, burnout, that story I told you about my, kind of values getting in the way. Mm-hmm. And there's one in there, from Heather. And then the metaphor throughout the whole book is a kaleidoscope. And the cover of the book is a kaleidoscope inside it. And what we're saying is that everybody in the child welfare system, there's always a different color, a different shape, that every time you turn it, something shifts.
Uh-huh.
And so to be aware that all those colors and shapes are there all the time. And so we really address that idea of how do you treat trauma when children are constantly feeling threatened? How do you treat attachment?
Wow. Yeah.
And so how do you kind of do all these things instead of turning into someone who just puts out fires? And that's really what we kind of wanted to address.
Yeah, that sounds like really good stuff. Well, if anybody wants to get a hold of you, either ask you questions about things that you talked about on the podcast or whatnot, how could they get a hold of you, Sheri?
They can certainly email me at the university, and I'm hope you'll put it on somewhere because I'll give you the email.
Okay.
But it's P as in Peter, ICKO, V as in Victor, S as in Sam, A as in Apple, at udmercy.edu.
Okay.
And then they can also call me at the university at 313-993-1626.
Okay, and I will put your email address and phone number in the show notes along with your book and the link on how to get to your book on Amazon, I guess, so people can get that if they want to. So.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for joining me today, Sheri. This was very insightful, and I certainly learned a lot about the child welfare system, and really appreciate you coming on today.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Okay. All right. Wasn't that great stuff? I loved listening to Sheri talk about her experiences in the child welfare system. I think she's just a wealth of knowledge. And the mental notes takeaway today is this. It's important to look at the reasons behind behaviors of foster kids, like bedwetting or misbehavior and whatever it is, to truly understand why they might be exhibiting those behaviors. Understanding the context of the foster child's behavior is key. So, for example, poverty, trauma, attachment insecurity, mental illness, all those types of things are important things to keep in mind. That's really the backdrop for a lot of these things that are going on with these kids. Now, as always, with the Make a Mental Note podcast, education is the key to mental wellness. So I always like to ask questions about what my guest presented. And here's my question for you. What did Sheri say was foundational to any kind of work that's done with foster kids and their parents or caregivers? Do you remember what that was? Empathy. It goes back to what I was just talking about with the mental notes takeaway. If you keep in mind context, in other words, the child's world and everything that they've dealt with and are dealing with, and the same goes for their parents or caregivers, by the way, then you're going to be a much more effective helper because you are being empathic. You're trying to place yourself in their shoes to truly understand their experiences as best as you can anyway. So that's foundational. That's what it's all about. And this is what we strive for as helping professionals. But just as any person who interacts with foster care kids can do the same thing, is to try to place yourself in their shoes to truly understand what's going on from their perspective. Well, please visit my website, chrisquarto.com, for the show notes of this episode. And hey, if you'd like to continue listening to my podcast episodes, then consider subscribing to the podcast series. It's really easy to do. Just install a podcast app on your phone or your tablet. You probably already have one on there and don't even know it if you're not using it yet. My personal favorite is Downcast. But any podcast app will do. And then just once you have that installed, just do a search for the Make a Mental Note podcast and subscribe. It's really that easy. I release these every Thursday. So I hope you keep on listening and have a great rest of the day.